Hello everyone, thanks so much for joining me today for episode 4 of my Embroidery 101 class, where I show you how to take a piece of fabric and some thread and turn it into, in this case, a needle book with a beautiful embroidered design on it. My name is Christy and I am an embroidery and textile artist. I also design cross-stitch patterns, and I just wanted to create a series where people who hadn't stitched before, who hadn't done any kind of embroidery before, could jump in and end up with a finished product and feel confident about tackling perhaps more difficult stitches. So this is the finished product and this is the pattern. Obviously it's a stitchy themed pattern, which I think is really fun. I really love it. And this is a needle book. It's the final project we'll be making. So there are pages for needles, there is a place for some scissors, and it has a cute cover. And today we're going to be doing the chain stitch, which is right here and also around the outside of the hoop over here, and also the split stitch, which is the outside of the scissors. I don't believe I use it on this side at all. Oh no, it's also this here, this piece of thread that kind of goes down through this needle here, this needle. So today we're going to work on the split stitch and the chain stitch. Now the split stitch is a variation of the back stitch, which you learned in my last video in episode 3. If you haven't watched the previous videos, I recommend that you check them out. I'll put the playlist right up here. And the last video was the back stitch, which as you see was the outside of the thimble, the green in the tomato, the inside of the scissors, and then these little like swirly decorations on the scissors. So today we're going to finish up this thimble, at least the outside of the thimble, and do the outside of the scissors. When you download the pattern, you will see that it has different symbols on it. And this smaller dotted line is the back stitch that we did for the last video. And in this video, we're doing the dark black and this larger dotted line. This gray here is a different stitch. So the chain stitch is this dark black there and there, and the stem stitch is right here around the scissors. So that is the plan for today. I am going to do my stitching in this gray. This is DMC 4, which is the gray / silver that we see throughout the project. And I'm using 3 strands, it looks like. Yeah, 3 strands. And I'm going to use the away knot method that I talked about in the last episode. So just as a reminder, for the away knot, I like using a little quilter's knot. And you end up with a, well, this isn't very neat, but it doesn't have to be neat. And then you start it from the front. And then this here is woven into, I'm going to stitch over here, but this length here is woven into the back of the stitches that you do. So I want to start with a chain stitch, and a chain stitch is essentially a loop that is caught by another loop, right? So you start with a loop, you come up out of the loop wherever, however long you want that loop to be, and then you start another loop. So I'll show you how to do that. And I'm going to show you 2 different ways. The first way is the standard chain stitch. The second way is a reverse chain stitch. And then I created a circle here because the nice thing about chain stitches is that you can make a seamless circle of chains. And you're going to need that for the hoop section. You don't want like a stopping and starting of the hoop. For a chain stitch, you want to come up at the beginning of the line. Now remember, for the back stitch, you came up 1 stitch ahead of the line, but in this one you want to come up at the beginning of the line. And you want to go through the same hole you just came out of. And essentially what you're forming is this loop. You want to pull it a little bit slowly, not all the way through. To about here is good. Kind of open it up, and then you choose how large you want your stitch to be. So I'm just gonna go right there, and you want to come up inside the loop. So when you pull this not too tight but a little tight, you get a loop. And then once again, you go through the same hole again. Make sure you have a loop. Come up inside the loop, 1 stitch away, and pull it. Now, you don't want it too tight. If you pull it too tight, it gets kind of straight and doesn't have that nice loopy chain feel. But if you do that, you can just loosen it up a little bit, and then, you know, it works again. Go through the same hole. Give yourself a little loop at the end. Come up 1 stitch away. And pull it. So there's a loop. And you just do that until you get to the end of the row. Once you get to your last chain, you're not making any more loops. So what you would do is you would go right on the other side of that loop, go through the fabric, and tack it down. And this is what you would do, for example, for the bottom of the thimble, because this is just a line. And because it's just a line, you do have to start and end it. And so you can see, I don't know if you can see, but my tacked edge is right there. And so you have your tacked edge, and you weave in your end, and you're done with this. One of the fun things you can do with chain stitch is if you put them close together, it actually looks like knitting. So if you want to make a little texture in like a sweater embroidery of a sweater, you can use the chain stitch to fill it out, and it looks like it's been knit. But they all have to face the same way. So how then do you come back down but have them face the same way? And that is called a reverse chain stitch. So with that, you start at the end and go to the beginning. So you start from this end with the tack down and move this way. So we're going to do that. So what you do is you just do a short stitch, and you don't want this short stitch too tight, and you come up a stitch away from that. I like using the back of my needle if possible, because then I won't pierce this tacked thread. But with the needle, the back of the needle, you go through the stitch you just did, the tack stitch, down in the hole you came out of, and you have a chain. And then you just kind of keep doing that over and over again. Go a stitch away. Don't pull it too tight, because then it'll mess up this loop. Go through the loop, and then back in the same stitch. And once again, come up a stitch away. Use the eye of the needle to go underneath this last stitch. Go down in the fabric in the hole you came up out of, and just continue on your merry way. And for your last loop, you just, you know, do the same thing, and then you're done. You weave in your ends. Now this, it doesn't matter which one you choose. They both create the same effect. They both create the same stitch. They're just different methods for getting that stitch done. They look exactly the same if you make them the same size. I made this first stitch here smaller than this one, and so that's why it looks different, but it really is the exact same stitch. Now when you're stitching a circle, you have to use the, well, you don't have to use anything, but if you want a smooth, unbroken chain around a circle, you have to use the original chain stitch as opposed to the reverse chain stitch. But if you're just doing a straight line of chain stitches or filling in an area with chain stitch, either one works fine, and basically it's just personal preference. Now I'm going to weave in all my ends, reload my needle, and then start on this chain stitch in a circle. Because this circle is so close to this line, all I did was just weave it into that line instead of doing an away knot. An away knot's really good because it does help you, you know, it gives you space to weave in the ends, but it does take up a lot of thread. So whenever I have the chance, and especially if it doesn't quite matter if you see the string from the floss from the front, I just weave it in. So you want to, for chain stitch, like I said, use the original chain stitch method, where you come up in the thread, you go down in the same hole, and then you come up a stitch away through the loop. And then you go into the hole you just came out of, come up one stitch away through the loop, and pull. Again, not too tight because you want this to be a nice loop, but you still want to make sure that it's flush. You don't want it too floppy. Nobody likes a floppy loop. I guess I can't say that. Some people might like a floppy loop. I personally do not like a floppy loop. Go down through the same hole, come up a stitch away through the loop, and pull it. And you just work your way around the circle, making loopy chain stitches. One thing I want to add is that the nice thing about embroidery is you can spin it around, right, to make it easier for you, and you can kind of figure out the direction of stitching that's most comfortable for you and run with it. Basically, you don't have to be rigid about it. You don't have to be on a big frame. You can just do it in your hand, in a hoop in your hand, and stitch however makes you feel most comfortable. I know a lot of people do use a stand. I don't, and I had thought about getting a stand for this embroidery series, but knew that for me it wouldn't be comfortable. It wouldn't be comfortable to stitch in a static way. That is not how I stitch, and I want to show a different way of stitching, or I don't know if it's different. And you know, I wanted to show how I stitch and how you can stitch with minimal equipment, we'll say that. Now we are on our last stitch, and you want to do this last stitch as if you were doing a reverse chain stitch. So you take the eye of your needle, go through the final stitch, or the first stitch, I'm sorry, the first stitch that you did, and then go through the hole that you came out of. And that gives you a nice solid chain line. And I just think that it's very lovely, and it can be very useful for borders. It can be useful for curvy lines. Chain stitches are actually quite versatile, and I like a good chain stitch. Now I did make some of these too loose, so this here is a little floppy. So you remember what I said about not liking floppy loops? I don't like that. But I figured I would leave it just to show you what not to do. And then when you turn it over, you get this really nice solid line, and you weave in your ends. And the thing about chain stitches is that they eat up a lot of floss. You know, each stitch takes up 3 times the floss as a back stitch, or as just the stitch, right? So just keep that in mind, that it does eat up a lot of floss. So that, my friends, is the chain stitch. So I'm going to take us over to the pattern, and we'll stitch in the bottom of that thimble. I'm using the number 4, DMC 4, to do this chain stitch, which is the exact same color that I had just used for the demo. I'm using 3 strands because I do want it to be a little bit chunky. I do like a chunky chain stitch. I gotta be honest with you. But I want to give you a little tip about weaving in your ends. When you're weaving in your starting end, you weave in 3 times. And so you want to start your first weave heading towards where you plan on starting your first stitch. So in this case, I'm weaving in here and I want to weave towards the end where I'm going to start. And then I like to leave an inch, 2 centimeters, and I'll cut that off, but that gives me some leeway if I pull a little bit too hard and it slips a little bit. So there's my first weave, my second weave, and my third weave. I hope you can see that. And then we have this piece at the end. So now we are going to start our stitching right here. So it comes up here. And I plan on doing a traditional regular chain stitch. Make the loop, come up through the loop. Don't pull too tight, but you know, firm. Go through the same hole. Come up 1 stitch away. And for your last stitch, you want to come up slightly before where you want to end. So I don't know if you can see this, there's a lot of things happening here, but I'm slightly next to where I want this to end. And then that gives you space to go down where you want to end for your final tacking stitch. And then you have a fairly neat chain stitch, which is a nice kind of chunky outline stitch. And now what you do is you weave in your ends, and then we'll start on the split stitch. As with most stitches I've shown you, the split stitch has 2 different methods. We have a split stitch and a split back stitch, but they basically look the same. And in our case, it will be the outline of the scissors. Split stitches are very good for outlining because they are thin, unlike a chain stitch, which can get a little chunky, and they're a solid line, unlike a back stitch, which has a very clearly defined stitch pattern, right? So the nice thing about split stitches is that it's just a very solid line. So as I said, there are 2 different versions, or 2 different methods. The first one is the one that they'll teach you as a true split stitch. And so that is when you come up at the beginning of the design, go 1 stitch away, and then you want to come up in the middle of that stitch and split that stitch. And then you go 1 stitch away. And if you notice, you're splitting it in the middle. So for your next split, you want to come up through that hole as close as you can and splitting the stitch before. So this is basically the reverse of a back stitch. And I'll show you on the back, because if you do it correctly and perfectly, you will have a beautiful back stitch on the other side. Now, I am not one for perfection, and I don't think that perfection is necessary. And the nice thing about embroidery is that you can make beautiful things without being perfect. But you want to come up in the middle and split that stitch. Doing a split stitch is easiest if you have more than 1 strand of floss, but you can do it with only 1 strand of floss, because even a strand of floss is still made out of various fibers. And I'm going to be honest, I actually find this stitch to be quite difficult. As you can see, I kind of struggle to pierce the thread. So I usually use the other method, but this is the official method. So I'm showing that to you first. And it does look neater in the end when you come up through your stitch. And you just continue on until you're finished with your line. And you have a really neat line, right? And that's if you look at the difference between this line, which is a back stitch, has a very clearly defined stitch, and this one, which is more solid, you can see what the difference is. This is actually a really nice stitch to use in filling as well. There is a type of embroidery called Opus Anglicanum, which is English work essentially, and it's a medieval kind of stitching. If you look on Instagram, there is a woman named Tanya who does Opus Anglicanum, and she has a book out about it that she just released not too long ago, and you can see how she uses the split stitch to fill in different faces, to fill in different objects. But let's talk about the split back stitch. And for the split back stitch, it's basically a back stitch, but instead of going through the next hole, the hole that you had just gone through, you go through the stitch. So I start with one stitch, then I come up a half stitch away, and I split the stitch from the top. Come up a half stitch away, well, come up one stitch away now, and split the stitch. Come up a stitch away, split the stitch. And so this is essentially making a similar line, but you're going down through the thread instead of up through the thread. And I don't know if you can see it, but going through the thread makes a very clear, it almost looks like a tiny little chain stitch. Whereas coming up is a much more even stitch. But like I said, I just kind of struggle. I struggle sometimes with the original split stitch. And sometimes I just like making it easier on myself, and I'm not so worried about it being super smooth. And in this case, because that last stitch is fairly large, I tend to come up through that hole again and just split the stitch in half that I just made. So I don't make a new stitch, I just split that one in, and then it just makes it a nice kind of ending. And then you even the ends. And so if you look on the back, the normal split stitch is just a nice little back stitch. The split back stitch looks more like the back of the back stitch. So there's way more thread being used. So if you're trying to conserve floss, the regular split stitch definitely uses less floss. And I will weave in my ends, and then we'll start on with the gold. Now if you look at the pattern, you'll see that this gray here is shaded in. So what we're going to just do is stitch around the outside here and then up this middle line and around this way. So that's going to be the split stitch. This here is a satin stitch, which we'll learn possibly next time. Satin stitch is kind of the stitch that machine embroidery uses. It's just the back and forth stitch. So we'll learn that later. But for now, we're just going to do the split stitch around the outside of the scissors in our gold color, which is, I believe, 781. If I'm wrong, I will correct it. It's this gold color here. I think I just want to do it in 2 strands so that it's nice and thin. I pulled it out of off the floss drop in the easiest way I know how. Thread my needle, and I'm going to start, I think I'm going to start over here, right here. So I'm going to weave in my end into this inner circle of back stitches that we did last time. And now we're really secure. And I like at this point to cut off this little end. Because what can happen is if you don't cut that off, it can get pulled through the front, and then you have these little like tufts of the end sticking through. Now we just follow the line around with our split stitch. And I'm going to do the right split stitch. I'm going to do it the right way. I'll show you what it looks like with 2 strands. And the nice thing about the split stitch is that you do have a lot of control. You can make really curvy lines and it'll still look curvy, as opposed to with back stitches, if you go too curvy, it doesn't look like a curve anymore. But with the split stitch, because you're coming through the thread, you can guide where it goes. So in that case, it wanted to go, this stitch here wanted to be very straight into this curve, but because I split it in the middle, it shifted that, like the center of the stitch, to where I wanted it to be. The curviness of this is very useful for like this curve here and this curve here. So you can have a nice curve and not have to worry about it looking kind of pointy like it does here. And don't forget, you want to stitch around the outside and then down this center line and then up. So this section here will be a different stitch. This will be the satin stitch. And this is what it should look like at the end. So these 2 stitches are really useful and versatile. They are both outline and filling stitches, although in general, most people use a split stitch as an outline stitch. But they can provide really nice texture, and the split stitch does a really nice job of outlining with a delicate, solid line. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about these 2 really versatile stitches. And in my next video, I'm going to teach you the stem stitch and the straight stitch. And these are 2 more versatile stitches that can be used in any number of ways. And in fact, the stem stitch is probably, if someone said, what's your favorite stitch? What's your go-to stitch? It would be the stem stitch. So I look forward to showing that to you. Thanks so much for joining me. Please take good care of yourselves and have a good one. Bye.